Hey guys, Nolan Swatsky here from the Manitoba Wildlife Federation. Last week I got to sit down with Frank Baldwin, the wildlife biologist for the Canadian Wildlife Service. We just chatted a little bit about the upcoming spring conservation Canada Goose season, and so he answered a bunch of questions that were kind of arising based on the need for the season and just some of the information surrounding this conservation season. So I hope that you guys find this video helpful. If you have any additional questions, there's going to be some links down below that can hopefully answer some of those. Or you can head over to our website at mwf.mb.ca. One more thing, Frank's Wi-Fi wasn't great, so there's not going to be a lot of him in the video. It's going to be montages of banding photos as well as some slideshow data and stuff like that. So hopefully you guys find it helpful. And yeah, so upcoming soon, based off of this, we're going to have kind of like a how-to in terms of setting up for the season because it's new to a lot of people, including myself. So see you guys on that one. My name is Nolan Swatsky. I'm the newest member of the Manitoba Wildlife Federation, and I'm joined today by Frank Baldwin of the Canadian Wildlife Service. He is a wildlife biologist. How are you doing, Frank?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Basically, I just kind of wanted to start off with a little bit of introducing you and kind of your role, because I know that you've worked for government for many years now and been involved in lots of management with the goose populations and lots of the research and stuff. So I was just gonna ask maybe to do a little intro about your position and your role and kind of like the stuff that you're working on.
Yeah, sure. So I'll give just a little bit of my background. Born and raised in Manitoba. Spent most of my life here, other than some short stints moving away for school and uh, and and sort of my early part of my career in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I've been in Manitoba. So I was born and raised around the Okanagan Marsh area, and worked for Canadian Wildlife Service. Immediately after finishing my graduate work on Arctic nesting geese, and then a few years into that, I had an opportunity to come back and work for the Manitoba government as a game bird manager. So I held that position from 2008 till 2018, and then I took a different position with the Canadian Wildlife Service, which is where I am now. And so these days, I'm responsible for the migratory bird management and monitoring programs in Manitoba as part of our prairie region, and then also run some Arctic programs, specifically the Arctic Goose banding program in Nunavut, and yeah, and enjoying my time here.
Awesome. Okay, so we're mainly focusing today on the upcoming spring goose hunting season. And so we're kind of hoping to ask you a little bit about the background of how the season came about and like maybe some of the reasons why it came about.
Yeah, certainly. So the first thing I would say is it's technically not a hunting season; it's a conservation season. So it's a population for which has been designated overabundant, which means that we wish to use a conservation season or hunting to try and control um, the population. So I guess I'll start out by just discussing a little bit about how migratory game bird regulations work in North America and how that relates back to the original treaty. And so I think it's important for people to understand that the treaty, the 1916 treaty, which then became a acts in the United States and Canada in 1918, was written such that you could have 107 days of hunting between the period September 1st and March 10th of each year, maximum.
Okay.
And obviously, a lot of places have fewer days than that. And so, in order for seasons to fall outside of that area, um, the there has to be a designation of overabundance for that population, which means it has to fit the definition for overabundance, which in the migratory birds regulations, um, it says that an overabundant population is one for which the rate of population growth has resulted in or will result in a population whose abundance directly threatens the conservation of migratory birds, themselves or others, or their habitats, or is injurious or threatens agricultural, environmental, or similar interests. So that's the wording, specific in the regulation. And so years ago, snow geese and Ross's geese were designated overabundant due to concerns about habitat degradation in subarctic and Arctic areas. And in this case, it's a little bit different. They've been designated, giant Canada geese have been designated as overabundant because of concerns around human safety and also agricultural and other environmental interests. So a little bit of a distinction there between hunting seasons and conservation seasons.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. And like, as somebody that's just getting into hunting, I just like assumed, oh, they're opening a new spring hunting season. But that's really cool that there's a distinct designation for the overabundant populations, and that's good to know. You said that you're targeting the giants, like the Canadas, the giants in particular, and I'm just wanting to know, or could you elaborate a little bit about how like this spring season is doing that, and how like you're selectively kind of targeting just the overabundant population?
Yeah, sure. So the reason that this population, has been designated overabundant is because it exhibits a variety of traits of overabundance. So it has a very high annual rate of increase, in the neighborhood of around 10 to 12% annual rate of increase. It over a long period of time, so sustained annual increases. It's been increasing at that rate since the 90s or so. It's been increasing across the giant Canada Geese, of course, have been increasing across the flyway, across North America for years. And we have really specific data to this population for management purposes. So we have good banding data from two populations of Canada geese and one population of cackling geese, which represent all of these, white-cheeked or Canada cackling geese that migrate through Manitoba. And so we know, based on a combination of population estimates, derived from banding data or harvest data, or from population surveys themselves, we can estimate, rate of increase for these different populations. And we can also estimate harvest rates and, using banding data. So the proportion of the population that's taken each year, as well as their annual survival rates for juveniles and adults. And so these, combined with a variety of other statistics on agricultural damage, specifically which occurs in the summer when those other Arctic nesting populations are already north, as well as things like vehicle collisions in urban areas, which occur during the summer. So data from Manitoba Public Insurance, sort of the whole combination of all these data sources really provided the rationale for the designation. So these other populations that nest in subarctic areas or Arctic areas, in the case of cackling geese, don't exhibit those traits. They don't have rapid population increase. They're mostly, slightly increasing to stable. In one case, these subarctic Canada geese, they have harvest rates which are up near sort of the threshold at which, the population can handle. Whereas Canada geese, we know they're harvested at a threshold, that doesn't affect that's not high enough to stop their population growth. So we know from the banding data that we're shooting about 10-11% of the adult population each year. And we know from population modeling that if we're to stabilize the population, we need to be shooting on the order of about 15%.
Okay.
And the biggest issue with our fall seasons is we've really taken all sorts of measures to try to increase harvest rates on this population through longer seasons. So we used to open our season later in September. It's been moved right up as early as it can to September 1. Our bag limits have undergone a change from 5 to 8 to even 12 around the city of Winnipeg. Numbers of other changes, and we can't affect the harvest rates on this population in the fall, probably because of the buffering that we get from these other northern populations that migrate down and swamp out some of the harvest. So, hunters are unable to, there's no way for hunters to target this specific population during that fall time period.
So you're not just getting the giants that are in overabundance right now, you're getting a mix of everything kind of.
Right, we're getting a mix of those other two populations in the fall. We know
Mm-hmm.
that from some other harvest derivation work that we've done. And we also have molt migrant giant Canada geese from all over the flyway that are on their southern migration going back to their natal areas when
Mm.
our seasons, before those Arctic populations come down. So we're getting really a swamping effect in the fall. And so that's where the interest of having a March season sort of came in, is that if there was a difference in migration chronology between these populations in the spring, which we suspected there probably was, that we might be able to pinpoint this time period for and put all the harvest pressure on this local nesting population of temperate Canada geese or giant Canada geese.
Okay, yeah. So then basically the reason for the March, having it set in March, is so that you're only selecting for the overabundant species and you're not getting the mix of the other populations in there.
Right.
And
So
you,
we
sorry?
sorry. Well, I was going to say, yeah, we think that that was the hypothesis, and so what we did was we put tracking devices called geolocators
Mm-hmm.
on these three populations of geese over a period of 3 years, starting in 20, 2015, I think it was 2015 or 2016. We started looking at uh, the timing of migration of these birds in spring, because we have lots of really good data from fall using band recoveries. We can look at migration chronology using long-term banding data and recoveries, but we don't really have much information from the spring due to there's only small amounts of rights-based harvest in the springtime, so very few band recoveries. So
Mm-hmm.
so what we found from that work was that, yeah, there was quite a big difference in the migration chronology of these birds. So the giant Canada geese arriving much earlier than the other two populations. So the subarctic nesting birds and the cacklers coming through Manitoba in early April to mid-April time period, with a bit of variation, annual variation in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that we use that information to time the season for the period that it is now, March 1st to March 31st, using the data that we had at hand in 2019 when the proposal was originally published to sort of meet the regulatory timelines. So so that's the rationale for the timing of the season. Is it closes at the end of March to based on the information we had at that point, to avoid the harvest of those non-target populations which aren't considered overabundant.
Yeah, that makes sense. So does that mean then that going forward, potentially, like as you collect more and more data from the geolocator bands, is it potentially that the dates of the spring season would be kind of shift around according to when you see like the migration patterns and stuff, like in a bigger picture with more data?
Yeah, great question. So, I think that since the publication of the proposal in 2019, we've gotten a lot more geolocators back through both harvest and recaptures, especially on the cackling goose population, which was relatively small sample size. And currently, we have a graduate student working at University of Manitoba with Kevin Fraser. Her name's Leanne Neufeld. She's working on this project. And one of the chapters of her thesis is using all of the data that we've assimilated to this point and making recommendations about future season timing. So it's possible that the season dates could change. It's possible that they could move up a little bit depending on how precisely we can estimate, that timing and how much variation there is year to year also. Because when we're making these regulatory changes, we make them years in advance, year 2 years in advance in some cases. And so we don't necessarily know what the weather conditions are going to be, so we have to be a little bit conservative from that standpoint. But and that's the reason why the season opens March 1st also, is in many years that's going to be far too early for any geese to be around. But in some years there are geese here in early March. We've even had geese here in February, and one real anomaly year. So the idea was to time the season to give sort of maximum flexibility for hunting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was wondering though, apparently, so the initial season of this took place from March 1st to 10th. Is that correct? When it first came out?
Yeah, so when it first it came out actually as a hunting season because remember we can have 107 days between September 1st and March 10th, and so we had some additional days that we weren't using in the fall
Oh.
because because of the freeze up tends to end our seasons before the calendar ends our seasons, and so what we did was we added those days in March um, while this proposal
Hmm.
for overabundance was going through the works, thinking that we would hopefully be able to extend it, but putting those days there just in case there was years where we did have Canada geese in Manitoba at that time, and yeah, those were both fairly normal springs those 2 years, and obviously very little harvest opportunity.
So we're talking a lot about the data from those geolocators and the bands in general and how that helps to make these management decisions. Just out of curiosity, like, I guess a two-part question would be how effective is hunting for controlling populations versus like any other method, and also like how important is the role of hunters in terms of reclaiming those bands and getting that data back.
Sure. So, in terms of the importance of hunting on the population, that varies amongst waterfowl, and that in terms of the effect on the dynamics of that population. But for Canada geese and geese in general, we know that hunting is a really substantial proportion of total mortality for adults. So we're mostly interested in what effect harvest harvest has the largest effect on the adult part of the population, but the survival in the adult part of the population has the most effect on the demography of the population. So um, we know that mortality from other sources are very, very minor on adults, especially something as large as a giant Canada goose. And so that mortality accounts for, is really is crucial in management. And so um, if we can if we can get our harvest rates up into that neighborhood of 15% uh, per year, I think we stand a pretty good chance of bringing this population under control. But of course, the big factor we're up against is declining hunter numbers. Which is a case in Manitoba and right across Canada. So, um, uh, I guess there's two parts to that equation. So there's the providing the extra days for hunting, but we're continually losing hunters every year.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then just in terms of the importance of hunters in the management programs, yeah, vital. So both in reporting bands, so when hunters shoot a banded bird and report it, and it goes through to the Canadian Bird Banding Lab, all that data goes into a big database and allows us to perform all of these sophisticated statistical analyses. And in some cases, for other population, even allows us to estimate abundance when we can combine it with harvest surveys, which are also, we only have if we have hunter participation. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, hunter participation is really crucial to the whole monitoring and management of migratory birds.
Totally. Um, I guess one of the questions that had come up from, I guess, the initial start of the season is concerns about um, would this be targeting geese that are nesting?
So the geolocators that we deployed in those years, um, those are just devices that record light levels at time and then store the data on a hard drive, which we can later extract, which we either get during recaptures, during banding operations, or also from hunters. When hunters shoot a bird with a geolocator and then return it to us, and the sensors the geolocators are mounted on leg bands, plastic leg bands. So the birds, they're all deployed on adult females, and so when the birds sit on those, we get a dark signature when the birds begin incubation. And we know from some of this geolocator that was data that we have for giant Canada geese that most of those birds aren't nesting until April. They're
Okay.
nesting mostly. I think it was about the second week of April, sometimes even a little bit later. So we really shouldn't be the current timing of our season really should avoid the nesting period. It will probably capture a period, the pre-nesting period where birds are really territorial, and that should make them fairly easy for hunters to decoy.
Hmm. That's I mean, I just goes to show how important those geolocators are in terms of
Yeah,
how much data you can get from those.
yeah, they generated a really amazing amount of data, and just another contribution to the hunters. About half of the total recoveries of all of the geolocators we deployed, which we I think we were on the neighborhood of about 120 devices back. About half of those came back from hunters, from across the flyway, Manitoba and points south.
Nice. So I guess another question would come up for hunters potentially is if the season is designated to target like the giant species, what happens if somebody shoots a subspecies or a cackling goose or something like that? Is that something to be concerned about?
That's probably that's a great question. Um, I'd say that's probably a great question for someone on the enforcement side, either on the provincial side or perhaps the federal side. I would say that the chances of that with the current season dates are extremely low.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those, those populations based on our geolocator data were much further south in the flyway consistently, among years. So I'd say very low chance of that happening, but I would imagine there would be some, discretion in the field, but probably a great follow up question for someone in enforcement.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so then this season, is it like something that's going to be around every year kind of thing until the population can kind of be managed back to a appropriate level or something like that, or is it like a year by year basis?
Well, it's once it's approved and in the regulations like it is now. It's in until we remove it until we think that there's you know there's sufficient rationale to remove it. And so that would be a I guess that would be a discussion that would happen in the future, and we would use all of our monitoring programs to make a decision. Both you know provincially and federally. That will be something we'll discuss. I think every year we'll look at that monitoring data that we have from our waterfowl breeding population survey, and also the harvest rates from our banding data, and look for a signal that we've had the effect that we hope we have. So it's something that we'll review frequently.
Okay. And so like this spring season, I guess some other questions might be is that could there be the potential for other waterfowl species for spring seasons? I'm assuming that's probably a no based on the fact that this is conservation season instead of an actual hunting season. It's not like, or it's for a specific management purpose, but yeah, maybe you could just answer that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, okay.
It's yeah, these conservation seasons are for populations that are designated as overabundant, which is a very rigorous um, you know process that we go through with lots of consultation. And so I would say it'll according to the regulations, it will remain for populations which match that definition of overabundance in the regulations.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. I guess a question for me would be, because I'm brand new to hunting, as you know, how would you? I'm trying to visualize how setting up for a season like this would work, or do you know what best approach or best practice would be for something like this?
Well, I think it'll be a bit of a learning curve for for all the hunters out there, but I suspect it's going to be a lot of opportunity around open water. So you think of the resources that are limiting in the springtime. Definitely open water, meltwater. In fields, edges of rivers or lakes that are opening. Those are areas where birds concentrate in the spring, and then areas around where birds are eventually going to be setting up their nesting territories too. So Canada geese love nesting on things like elevated platforms, like things like muskrat houses and things like that. So I think probably a fair bit of opportunity in edges of marshes, and then on on the days that people refer to as migration days, so those spring days where we get a break in the weather and we've got a nice southerly breeze and warm temperatures, those migration days, probably some good opportunity trafficking birds in fields that are just making their sort of leap up here in the spring. So probably a combination of things, and
Yeah.
I think I think hunters will probably figure it out quite quickly, and I think these birds, they obviously should be fairly naive to decoys at this time of year. So
Yeah.
I would expect, when there's birds here, success should be fairly high.
That's exciting. Well,
So
that's got me excited for it. Not that I have will
on.
know what I'm doing, but it's going to be exciting to try it.
Yeah, everybody's starting from scratch too. So
Yeah.
I like the good thing about I think that people are used to like the idea of eating like large amounts of equipment, lots of decoys, stuff like that, and in the fall, for hunting geese in the fall. And I think like a couple decoys even on the ice next to some water and a goose call
Yeah.
is all you need in the spring.
That's what I was hearing too. Like when people were talking about it, they were saying that you wouldn't need a lot of decoys, just like a handful of decoys, and it would be very, very basic compared to the fall.
Yeah, I think so. Very, very accessible, I think, for a lot of people, and I think accessible while ice fishing and stuff too. I think there's places you could fish for pike and hunt Canada geese at the same time.
Sounds like a lot of scouting and kind of playing it by ear and adaptive management or adaptive tactics.
I think so. Yeah, I definitely think so.
Awesome. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything else that you could think of that is important to know about the season, or did we kind of cover pretty much everything?
I guess maybe one more thing I would add is that the strength of this proposal and the monitor is really in that of our monitoring programs. So we have good banding data from all the three populations that we harvest, and we can really look at and measure any effect on any one of those populations. So if we did have a early migration of these subarctic Canadas or Canada Goose or things like that, and we had a significant harvest, which I don't think will happen, but if that did happen, we'd have a signal in our banding data. So
Yeah.
it really just like underscores the importance of monitoring programs. You can't do these sorts of things without really good monitoring programs in place. The thing that I always found really striking was like the increase in like the exponential increase in Canada geese since like the 1950s is like pretty shocking. Like
Yeah.
it's a straight up curve, like no deviation. It's like right straight up. It's pretty striking when you see that, and I think that's one of the reasons we didn't get any negative comments when we proposed this, is because everybody like it's kind of a no-brainer. Like they're pretty clearly
Yeah.
causing a lot of issues.
Is this growth just because of like agricultural whatever across their migratory paths, and like that's just contributed to their growth and like that kind of stuff? Is that the main factor?
Yeah, well, I think a couple things. It definitely agriculture, like all throughout the flyways. So massive increase in agriculture, like post Second World War. So birds coming back in like really good condition to breed. Whereas like winter used to be pretty hard on birds. Used to cause a lot of mortality just from malnutrition and then a refuge system. So thousands of refuges down the flyway now where birds have safety. Can't be disturbed.
Yeah.
And then I think one of the big things for us is just hunter numbers. Like we just don't our hunter numbers have declined pretty like 70 something % since the 1970s.
Wow.
And the population's been growing, and that's their main source of mortality just doesn't exist here anymore.
Yeah, no kidding. And then I guess that's why when with those increased tag or bag limits and stuff like that, like if you're not getting enough hunters out there, you're still not reaching that limit that you need, or that threshold that you need to actually manage the population. Well, that's all the questions I have.
All right, man.
All right. Well, thanks
Take
again.
care and be in touch.
Sounds good.
Okay.
See ya.
Bye-bye.